I'm going to go through a shortened version, about half the number of slides of the longer version of the slides that I had begun some time back, as you recall. And the longer one is more inclusive explicitly of the evolution of consciousness and gives us a chance to get into Gebser and other thinkers, whereas the shorter one is more focused on Gaia. So the title for today, which is a kind of compressed version of the evolution of consciousness but focused on Gaia, is Gaia Rising. So it will involve, we will go through some of the slides that you've already seen last time, but it's been a while, so it might be interesting to see them again. And then there'll be new slides. So the plan is for us to go through those slides with my commentary until break. Then we break, then we come back and have a discussion. And the discussion can, draw from what happens in the first part, as well as the reading if you want to bring it in. Does that sound good? Okay. Pleased to draw attention to our distinguished guest today, Phoebe Tickell.
Yes.
Phoebe Tickell, who is doing really exciting work. She's co-designing a course with Stephen Harding at Schumacher College now, the Gaia module for their Masters in Holistic Science. And we met some time ago at an intensive with Joanna Macy in the work that reconnects. And as luck would have it, Phoebe is visiting the Bay Area for a few days and contacted me just as I was about to give this presentation on Gaia Rising. So really happy that she's here today. All right, so the title for our time together is Gaia Rising. And you remember this image from a while ago, an artist's rendition of a black hole, which of course we have no real image of. But if we could be close enough to a black hole to see it, perhaps it might look something like this. And I choose it as a symbol of our moment, which in many ways feels like we're accelerating toward the event horizon of a black hole. And of course, a black hole is very mysterious. We don't really know what's inside or on the other side of a black hole. And the most that we can do is imagine what it would be like as we approach it. And some of the things that would happen would be increasing acceleration towards probably death of some kind. Certainly our bodies would die. The body as it was constituted as it approached the black hole would die. We don't know what would happen to it actually on the other side. But our time is something like an accelerating approach to the event horizon of a black hole or a singularity. And there are still people pinning a lot of hopes on the so-called technological singularity, involving the convergence of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, renewable energy, nanotechnology, all of which are themselves accelerating in their discoveries and development, not all of them exponentially, but a lot of them at an accelerating rate. And some people believe that they will converge in a way that will lead to a transformation of our physical environment and our civilizational environment in ways that we can only partially anticipate. Right? So this is the technological singularity. I am very ambivalent about, I certainly don't pin any hopes on a technological singularity, and I'm ambivalent about putting too much focus on it for reasons that we can explore later. So this is our moment. This is another indication of our moment, and the next couple of slides, the main thing I want to point out is exponential growth, or the approach to a kind of threshold beyond which it's very difficult to peer. I mean, on the one hand, if these thresholds are crossed, it does seem to point to collapse, death, unraveling of the biosphere. right? So this is a record of CO2 levels in the atmosphere for the last 800,000 years. So long before our species, probably halfway through the evolution of hominids, almost, or a third maybe. So you can see that the CO2 levels over this very vast stretch of time somewhat resemble an electrocardiogram, or the beating of a heart. And then as we approach our time, it just goes off the scale. It goes exponential off the scale. So there have been no humans that have ever lived in a time like this. There have been very few hominids even. Okay, so this is our moment. CO2 levels. These are projections of mean global temperature only over the last 1,000 years. So you could actually project this line quite far, certainly throughout the whole Holocene, the last 10, 12,000 years. And this is where we are now, with a little bit, actually it's a little bit more than 1 degree centigrade above pre-industrial averages. And that, corresponds to around 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And these are various projections coming out of the last IPCC report, which, as we know, are notoriously conservative. With each new report, they have to revise their assessments and bring their time projections much closer and up other variables as well. But the main thing to see here is that business as usual, which is what we're doing, will lead at least to a 4 degree centigrade increase before the end of the century. I mean, usually they say before the end of the century, but I mean, it could be, some people believe, within 10, 20 years. There's really no way of knowing. The system is so complex with so many feedback loops, we really don't know. But this is where we are. So if we do reach 4 or 5 degrees centigrade, which seems increasingly likely, these are the kinds of things that we can expect. And we're already seeing death of the coral reefs, glaciers disappearing with 1 degree, or a little more than 1 degree. And even if we stopped all burning of fossil fuels now, immediately and totally, without radical sort of geoengineering that could somehow draw down carbon out of the atmosphere, we're already committed to 2, 3 to 4 degrees centigrade. So that's the best case scenario as far as I can see. All right, so you can look at that more closely. It's not very encouraging. This is the other threshold, the kind of literally a threshold of death. It's the signal of the 6th mass extinction of species that we're in the early phases of right now. So this goes back 160,000 years, and it shows a constant rate of species extinction. So there's a background rate of species extinction over enormous stretches of time. You could actually extend this line from 160,000 years to 65 million years, which would, I'm not sure how far that line would go, but it would be very, very far before you had something like this. Okay, so this is where we are right now. We're the first humans, and apart from the tiny little shrews that were around, shrew-like mammals that were the only mammals around at the time of the dinosaurs, we're sort of the first mammals even to be around for such an event. Okay. And it's not a meteor that's doing it this time. It's us. It's the human presence on the planet, which has initiated a new geological age. The consensus around the name of this age is the age of the human, the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene. All right, so we've already seen this. Okay. Another striking image that gives a sense of the pervasive presence of the human on the planet. I mean, this is not only light from space, but regular travel routes. This is a graph showing nitrogen flux over time from chemical fertilizers, industrial agriculture. Okay. So all of these like exponential curves and hockey stick-like figures and that point to a rupture in geological processes and the death of one geological age and the birth of another age. From an archetypal perspective, alerts us to the fact that we are on a threshold of initiation on a planetary scale. So we know about the deep structure of initiation from anthropological studies. It's a universal feature it has been a universal feature of human culture for as long as there have been humans, as far as we can tell, even though formal initiations have largely disappeared in the modern period. There's a revival of initiatory practices, and they still exist in small circles and religious cults and professional organizations to a certain extent. But the amazing thing about our moment now is that the whole planet, not only the human species, but the whole planet, or at least, yes, the biosphere itself, including the anthroposphere, the human sphere, finds itself on a threshold which involves a near-death experience. And near-death experience is a key experiential dimension of rites of initiation. Okay? Now the goal of initiation, so on the top here I have Joseph Campbell's 3 phases of the hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell adapted these 3 phases from Arnold van Gennep, anthropologist who identified them as the deep structure of rites of passage or rites of initiation. They all have these 3 stages: separation, initiation, and return. So Joseph Campbell said that that's also the deep structure of what he called the monomyth, or the most prevalent kind of myth or sacred narratives that we find cross-culturally, that he also called the voyage of the hero. Now on the bottom I put what I consider to be an even deeper archetypal structure than separation, initiation, and return, and it's the basic archetypal structure of all process. Anything that involves process or evolution or development will have this minimally 3-phase structure, triphasic structure. And I borrow the two terms mostly from Hegel. So you have a principle of identity, which is the idea of whatever something is in itself. It's identical to itself, and it is what it is in itself. But for that thing to live and develop and evolve, it needs to go through a process of actualization, which involves differentiation. So a differentiation of latent potentials in order to become what it essentially is. So everything that is, whether it's a seed in the beginning or a fetus in the womb and so on, or the fertilized cell, in order for it to actualize its potential, it needs to undergo a principle of differentiation. Okay? So identity, difference, and through that process of differentiation, you have a new identity, which is in some sense the realization of the potential of the first phase, but it also involves the birth of something new that unless you've already seen the process, you can't predict what that new identity is going to be in its final form, because they're emergent properties. Okay, so this is the deep structure. So we find ourselves now, not only as a species, but life on the planet, having gone through a process of hyper-differentiation to the point of dissociation. The human presence on the planet has differentiated itself from the biosphere, and in many ways has dissociated itself to the point that it is having a feedback effect on the biosphere, threatening its very existence. Okay? However, let's not lose sight that this is probably, I'm just looking for my T's, right? Probably grounded in a deeper archetypal process. Okay, so another view on that archetypal process, image drawn from Rick's book, Cosmos and Psyche. And it's one way of thinking of, at least in the human situation, human culture, human consciousness. We're going to focus on human consciousness consciousness here for a second. One way of seeing this first phase of identity, and what we notice is that in what Rick calls the primal worldview, which is basically how humans experience themselves in their world for many, many, many thousands of years, up until the historical period, and to a large extent even up until the modern period. So for hundreds of thousands of years, up until around 500 years ago, this was the dominant, this is one way of characterizing the dominant organization of human consciousness. And it shows that the self, and that could be the individual relative to this community, could also be the human being relative to the other than human, could be the natural relative to the divine. The boundary is permeable. There's no fixed, firm, static boundary between individuals and communities, between human and other than human, between the natural and the divine. Instead, there's a more organic, fluid whole. So the shaded area here represents the presence of intrinsic meaning or value or spirit, you might call it. Okay? That's the primal worldview. Then the modern worldview can be characterized, which the modern worldview, beginning around 500 years ago, can be characterized by a differentiation of self from world, a differentiation of human from the other than human, an intensification of the difference between the natural and the divine, the human and the divine. And one of the effects is that the world starts to have its intrinsic value and meaning evacuated from it or withdrawn from it, as the human mind and the power of the human increases in potential. Okay? Now, whether you believe this to be true or not, certainly the effect is visible, because it's starting from this period that the human begins to exert ever more tangible effects on the rest of the world. Until we get to the late modern worldview, where the individual self often feels themselves radically cut off from any intrinsic organic connection with other individuals, and a lot of the time feels afloat in a world that is void of intrinsic meaning and purpose. It's a kind of quality-free space that only is filled with objects that are to be used and manipulated and so on, with only external relations among them. That's the late modern worldview. Okay. All right, this is an image of just going to be three images that go back to not the primal worldview, because these are actually historical, but they're in the earlier phases, the pre-modern phases of the historical period, but where the essential trait of the primal worldview is retained. Namely, you have a world that is qualitative. The cosmos is qualitative in nature. It's not conceived in purely quantitative terms. The human is seen as being embedded within a cosmos which itself is alive and has a kind of human form. So here we see the night sky in the form of the goddess Nut, and all of the stars are sort of tattooed on her body. The earth god is not represented here, but Nut is paired with Geb, and it's interesting that Ge and Geb must be a very old root, even older than Indo-European, because we have Gaia, geology, that sort of Ge word represents the earth. In the Egyptian context, so the earth was masculine, and the night sky was feminine. Okay. This is an image from Hildegard of Bingen. I want you to notice the structure work, because it's going to recur in a moment. So it's, and there's Hildegard in the bottom left, having her vision. And I can't pretend to understand the inner meaning of this of this totally, but to me, as far as I've been able to tell, it's a symbol of the cosmic Christ, of the new Adam, right? So you have the original Adam, which is the first archetypal human created in the Garden of Eden, and then you have the second Adam, who is Christ, whose appearance is supposed to redeem the consequences of the fall. And one of the reasons why the Christ can do that is because the Christ is actually a cosmic figure. So here, you can see that, but the implication is that the whole cosmos is the body of Christ. I have a whole bunch of others that I won't show you here, but I just picked this one. It's quite different. This is the Tibetan Wheel of Life. And it's, you're probably already familiar with it, but if you're not, the whole cosmic process of space and time is seen to be held within and an expression of the body of this divine figure, Mara. And the outer circle is the outer wheel is the wheel of dependent co-arising, so the different phases of dependent co-arising. And then the next area are the various realms. So you have the hell realm, the realm of hungry ghosts, the realm of animals, the realm of gods and goddesses, and then the human realm. Here, I'm not sure what this thing is here. It looks like you've got monks on the left, and I'm not sure who they are on the right. But then in the middle, you have the three poisons. Excuse me. Greed, hate, and ignorance. So the idea here is that the wheel of samsara, of rebirth, and of suffering. So the root causes of suffering and the wheel of rebirth into suffering are seen to be generated by these three poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance or delusion. Okay? But the main thing I want you to get here is that the whole thing is seen, it's not a Newtonian quantitative space or a Cartesian space, it's a qualitative space. So the cosmos is essentially qualitative, and it exists within the body of a god. This is the representation of the ancient Hebrew view of the world. Now, it doesn't exist within the body of God, unless you're in the mystical-Kabbalistic strand of Judaism, where indeed the whole cosmos, and not only the visible cosmos, but the subtler realms of the cosmos, are the various organs and structure of Adam Kadmon, or the archetypal human. But this is not the Kabbalistic, this is just the biblical cosmology of the ancient Hebrews. But the thing I want to point out is that it's still quite intimate. I mean, the dome of the heavens, it's like a stone dome that's held up by the mountains in the four corners of the earth. And above that dome is the waters. So there's rivers or ocean above the dome, just as there's water underneath. In other words, the whole cosmos is surrounded by a kind of amniotic fluid. This is what it seems to me. This is the ancient Greek view, centered obviously around the Mediterranean, and the great oceanus, or the great ocean that surrounds the whole world. So what we're moving into now is the evolution of the human and transformation of the human world picture. It corresponds to worldview in general, but in particular to the view of the world also. Right? So we're going to track the mutation of the human world picture as an expression of the evolution of consciousness. So we're transitioning out of this first phase of identity that we talked about into the phase of difference. But there's still the remnants of the primal phase. This is a representation of the shield of Achilles, the great hero of the Iliad, which is one of the earliest references we have of a kind of world map that existed on Achilles' shield. We don't have time to get into that here. But here, remember this image from Hildegard. Well, here you see again the head, the feet, and the hands. So this is one of the earliest European world maps we have. It's the Ebsdorf map. And you can see that it's not a literal, we don't recognize it as a literal and very useful map. It would be hard to navigate by it. But the first thing you notice is that, first of all, well, it's round, but it's also mapped onto the body of Christ. So the whole world is seen actually to be an expression of the body of Christ, with the feet at the bottom, the hands there. And the heart of this cosmic Christ, who is the world, the center of the world, is Jerusalem. Okay. And that's because space for the medieval Christians was, again, not a quantitative thing, which we still have in the English word to orient. You know, to orient yourself means to turn to the east. So to know where you're going or to know where you are, you want to orient yourself. And to do that, you turn to the east. Well, why would you turn to the east? Because that's where Jerusalem was for Europeans. Right? If you're a Muslim, you turn to Mecca, which would also be to the east for us as well. Yeah, so we don't have time to explore this fascinating map, but you can just get a sense. All right. This is another map of the world, and with Jerusalem in the center. And since God is three, there must be three main continents. These are the three main continents. You can see that, though, America, die Neue Welt, is tucked away at the bottom left, not quite sure what to do with it, how to fit into the archetypal scheme of three continents, and England floating happily on the top there. Okay. This is a Hindu representation of the world as lotus, with Mount Meru in the center.
Do we know if any of these images came before widespread knowledge that the Earth was round?
Well, I mean, there were people, particularly navigators, who believed that the world was round because they could experience it. But I don't know about in the Indian subcontinent. I'd have to do research on that. I mean, but it's often symbolically round, but not necessarily spherical. Okay. But starting about 500 years ago, the Europeans, to begin with the Portuguese, then the Spanish, then the French, then the British, the Dutch, but beginning with the Portuguese, actually circumnavigate the globe. Okay. Now, this seems to have been the first time that was done. I mean, it may be that earlier on there were some humans that made journeys between continents, but never a circumambulation of the whole planet. So that first happened about 500 years ago, and it set off a steady stream of not only travel around, but exchange of material goods, of human bodies, of animal bodies, of genetic material, of viruses, and of cultures and languages and so on between all of the continents. And that begins quite slowly at first, but then it accelerates and accelerates and accelerates. So here you can see the major trade routes and also the major slave trade routes. It's an interesting thing to study. Okay, so with this physical experience of the globe that can now be held in the memory of a single lifetime, and more people having this experience, the sense of the world and the human relation to the world starts to change dramatically. Now, coincidentally or not so coincidentally, within a few decades or very, very close to the first circumnavigation of the globe, you have the Copernican revolution, which signals the birth of modern science. Now, as you know, the Copernican revolution, it's usually talked about as displacing the Earth from the center and putting the sun in the center. But the net effect of the Copernican revolution, by the time you get to Newton especially, is actually to allow for the birth of a universal physics, which will apply not only to the stars, but to earthly matter as well. So the Copernican revolution is the first step in the development of a physics of terrestrial matter. And that's the precondition, that will be the precondition for the Industrial Revolution, for the technological revolution that will follow. Okay? In other words, a radical mutation of an amplification of the effect of the human on the rest of the world. It can't happen until you have modern science, and the beginning of modern science is the Copernican revolution. But you also need, Descartes' revolution in thinking, which will be taken up by Galileo in a big way. Right? But Descartes, who is going to propose and generate a mathematical view of reality and promulgate a new root metaphor for the nature of the cosmos. Now no longer that of a living body, so the body of the God, which is like a human body, but a machine. Okay? So essentially inert matter whose components are merely externally related to one another, which can be manipulated and controlled from outside. Right? This is what we can do with a machine that you can't do with a body. Okay? So this is starting to happen with Descartes, and it's very much tied to what Gebser, we don't have time to get into this here, but what Gebser describes as the mutation from a pre-perspectival to a perspectival form of consciousness, where that corresponds actually to the emergence of a purely quantitative space, as well as a spatialized time. Right? So prior to this period, there are no quantities without qualities. Even numbers are qualities for the ancient world. Starting about this time, quantity and quality get separated from each other. And in fact, as Galileo will famously argue, and he will be followed, he'll make a distinction between so-called primary qualities and secondary qualities. And by primary qualities, he actually means quantities, the things that can be represented mathematically. Okay? So that's all happening now. There's a clockwork universe. Now, once you have Cartesian perspectival space, you can have really accurate maps. Well, actually, you're going to need accurate clocks to do that as well. You're going to have fairly accurate mechanical clocks, which involves the spatialization of time, but also this new way of looking at the world perspectively. Yeah? And that will enable, eventually different forms of geometric treatment of space, especially the Mercator projection that is still, that we're all familiar with most world maps. And it'll allow for much more precise navigation and mapping of territories. To what purpose? Well, we know, to be plundered, controlled, exploited, colonized. Right? So the Portuguese kingdom, the Spanish kingdom, all of these kingdoms are struggling to become empires at this point through control of material resources and bodies, through the slave trade and through gold, and then followed by sugar, cane sugar, tea, and then furs, and then wood. I mean, all of the resources that empire can use for its own grandeur and control. This way of thinking and of conceiving of space and relating to the physical world will enable the forces of empire. Right, so eventually, it doesn't take long for the modern world picture to emerge, which is one of a series of nation states that define themselves through autonomy. Right? So the process of differentiation has gotten to the point where the human presence on the planet defines itself through a mutual competition and struggle for either dominance or position. Now, it does involve, at the same time, obviously, we might say the noble and virtues of freedom and autonomy, and indeed, many of these nation states saw their own emergence as a differentiation away from and an overcoming of what was experienced as, tyranny of previous monarchies and other regimes. So, if we put a value on the secular ideals of freedom and self-determination, the nation states represent a kind of success story, right? The other side, though, of this sort of geopolitical perspective is that the nation states are almost always involved in the struggles for empire, for global domination, for planetary domination. First of all, for regional domination, but if it's at all possible, for planetary domination. Now, it doesn't take long in the modern period for, especially once industrialization has gotten underway. So the first and the second industrial revolutions in particular have been established. For the conflict between nation states, the different rivalries, to eventuate in the First World War. Now, the First World War, okay? The humans had always had conflicts. The whole historical period is basically a chronicle of wars and conflicts. But for the first time in the historical period, there is war on a planetary scale, involving all of the continents, involving almost all of the nation states. The First World War, totally horrific, enormous, almost incalculable suffering. Then a brief respite, then the Second World War. Some people see the two world wars as organically linked, with just a kind of pause between them. Second World War, as we know, ends, I'm not saying it was ended by, but it ends with the beginning of the nuclear age. I personally do not believe or accept the official American position that the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that they had to be dropped and that they in fact ended the war. There's all kinds of evidence from American generals at the time and so on that they weren't necessary. I mean, the Americans had already destroyed the 35 largest cities of Japan. There were only a couple left. They'd already been completely leveled through firebombing. The Japanese army had been suing for peace for the previous 6 months and so on. The reason the bomb was dropped was as a demonstration to the Russians, who were about to invade the north of Japan, because the Americans knew that the Russians were poised to exert their hegemony on the Eurasian continent. What better way to stop them, make them pause, than to show them the awesome power of the nuclear bomb. Okay? So whatever you believe, 1945 does signal the beginning of the beginning of the nuclear age and the beginning of the Cold War. So the Second World War ends, the Cold War begins. And the Cold War will be characterized by a dipolar world where you have two empires, former Soviet Union, the American Empire, each one struggling for global domination. Okay? And that Cold War will be intrinsically involved with the space race. So I grew up during the space race. I remember, the last Gemini missions, and I remember all of the Apollo missions, which were, and I followed them with a kind of religious devotion as a young boy. And they were, it was a kind of religious experience for me, culminating in the first moon landing, and human beings walking on the moon. I mean, it just sounds absurd if you think of that human beings could travel to the moon, walk on it, and come back. But some people believe it didn't happen. But I saw it happen. I saw it happen live on TV. Anyway, it did happen. But what I didn't understand at the time was how the space race was part of this global race for global domination on the part of the two empires. I didn't know that as a 7 and then 10-year-old kid, but it was. Now, one of the great things, though, about the space race is, so you could say that the reason for the space race was empire, and more particularly to develop better and better missile technology as delivery systems for nuclear bombs, and to develop new communications and surveillance technology through satellites. And that's true. That's undeniable. That was the reason for the space race. At the same time, the space race became the occasion for a crucial phase in the evolution of the planet and of human consciousness. And that evolution, I think, is captured here, already signaled here. This is, if not the first, it's one of the first images of Earth from space, from the satellite 1959. So the 1957 is Sputnik, the first time that humans succeeded in putting a satellite into orbit. So the first time any organism had managed to intentionally free itself from the gravitational pull of the planet. This is amazing. But of course, a more accurate way of thinking of it is that it's not that an organism freed itself from the gravitational pull of the planet, because the organism is not other than the planet. Right? Humans, all organisms, we are the planet doing us, right? So the first satellite was actually the first time that Earth succeeded in extending a part of herself, in this case, so that she could see herself. So this is Earth's first selfie, basically. Okay? (1959), the first time that Earth, that we know of, that Earth was able to conjure an image of herself. And it's a very grainy image. It's imperfect. You can see that like Earth, or Gaia, as I'll call her from now on, Gaia is waking up. And it's not that Gaia was unconscious before, but clearly something new is happening here. There's a self-reflexivity that's happening. It's like a shift from consciousness to self-consciousness. And I think it's at this point that, potentially at least, we start to move from that, the further reaches of that second phase of differentiation that has gone over into dissociation, toward the third phase of a new identity. And what is that new identity? Well, it's a new identity for the human, certainly, as we're starting to realize now that we are a geological force. That's what the idea of the Anthropocene tells us. But we're also awakening to the fact that we are Gaian beings. So it's not only that we are a geological force, but our essential nature is intrinsic to the nature of Gaia. We are organic expressions of the evolution of Gaia. And it seems to be through us that Gaia is starting to wake up to herself. Okay? So this to my mind, gives us a clue to what this new identity, this third phase, what the goal might be toward which the evolution of consciousness is heading, or is trying to get to. And and we can see that the irony or the paradox, the tragedy even, is that it seems that the forces of empire, including rapacious capitalism and colonialism, all of that, the industrial revolutions, seems to have been, if not necessary, at least in the path we've taken, the means through which this new identity is trying to emerge. All right, from 1959 to 1968 in the Apollo 8 mission, where they, for the first time, the astronauts went around the dark side of the moon. They didn't land. Must have been a real disappointment for the astronauts, but they made it to the moon, went behind, and then came back, and took this very famous shot, the very first Earthrise, that became an iconic image for the environmental movement that was about to begin in earnest a couple of years after that. So again, I want you to get this different way of seeing it. This is not the first image taken of the Earth by a human being. It's the first image that Earth took of herself through a human being, which is not other than her. So again, it's like Earth holding a mirror to herself. It's not something other than Earth going away from Earth and looking back at Earth as an object. I mean, there is a kind of objectification and reflex that you need for reflexivity, but Earth and the spaceship that carried them and so on, they're all part of Earth. So this is the moment where Earth is looking back and getting the first really clear image of herself as a whole being. 1968. This is a very recent Earthrise image from a Japanese satellite in orbit around the moon. So you can see how the image of Gaia, the self-reflexivity on the part of Gaia, how quickly it's developed over these 50 years, 50, 60 years, from that first, from here to there to there. Okay. This is an image of Earth and our sister moon, of Gaia and sister moon, or Gaia and sister Luna, or Selene, I guess, which would be consistent with the Greek. So Gaia and sister Selene, from the Viking spacecraft on its way to Mars. So again, able to turn back and look on its way to Mars. So 1970, the first Earth Day. It's no mere coincidence. It's synchronicity that 1968, 69, 70 this year. Those of you who are archetypal cosmologically minded know that this is the sort of the high point of the last Uranus-Pluto alignment, which coincided with the culmination of the space program and the birth of the environmental movement as we know it, Earth Day. It also coincides within a few years with the emergence of the Gaia hypothesis, now referred to as the Gaia theory. It's no longer merely a hypothesis. There's just too much evidence and consensus around fundamental assumptions and data that it's gone beyond a mere hypothesis. It's a full-blown theory. So this is James Lovelock and statue of Gaia in the background, who along with Lynn Margulis, do you say Margulis or Margulis? Margulis. Margulis? Developed Gaia theory. So, what is Gaia theory? I mean, the basic idea is that, let me see, maybe the next slide will do this. Okay. This is a contemporary representation of components of the Earth system. So since Lovelock's and Margulis's time together, Gaia theory has been a formative influence on what now is called Earth system science. So, most of the scientists working in this area don't use the term Gaia theory. I mean, they may occasionally talk about it, but what they do, their inter and multidiscipline, is Earth system science. Now, It's too bad there's not time to go through the whole story of Lovelock. I mean, he was hired by NASA to determine whether or not, help determine whether or not, design an instrument that could fly to Mars and test whether there was life on Mars. But he was so bright that he realized that they didn't have to fly to Mars to see if there's life. All he had to do was to gather light from Mars and do a spectrographic analysis of it, test its chemical composition, which had already been done. And what one finds looking at the atmosphere of Mars is that it's in a state of almost total equilibrium. In other words, the signal from the light coming from Mars points to a planet without life. In contrast to the atmosphere of Earth, which has about 7% oxygen, I think, between 5-7% oxygen, lots of nitrogen, tiny, tiny amounts of carbon dioxide. Whereas on Mars, there's enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, almost no oxygen, no methane, which are very reactive. So how is it that on Earth you have these very reactive gases in fairly large quantities with oxygen and methane and so on? The answer is that you have them because of life. It's biotic activity coupled with geochemical cycling, hydrologic cycling that allows for a dynamic equilibrium in the mixture of reactive gases. Okay? So the atmosphere that we have on Earth, which has been this way for so long that we depend upon to be able to breathe, for instance, has been created by life, for life, and has maintained itself in an amazingly steady, dynamically steady state over long, long periods of time. This is the basic idea of the Gaia hypothesis, which at a deeper level says that in contrast to prior geological thinking, Earth is not a rock with water and atmosphere and then with life sprinkled on it as two separate systems, the abiotic and the biotic environment. Rather, the so-called abiotic environment and the biotic communities form a single self-organizing system. And we know that because even the oceans, I mean, Stefan Harding has alerted me to the fact that we probably wouldn't have oceans right now were it not for life. I mean, the hydrogen and the water would have, the hydrogen and the oxygen would have lost their bonds, and the hydrogen would have floated up and left the atmosphere. The oceans would have dried up. So the only reason why we have oceans is because of life. The only reason why we have the oxygen we breathe is because we have life. Even the motion of the tectonic plates can be attributed partially to the presence of life. Okay? But this is a more contemporary representation. Here is also a representation of what Earth system science allows us to do. So look at this. When you go from that first grainy image of Earth, now we're getting the equivalent of like not only X-rays, but PET scans, MRIs, and so on, of the body of Gaia in enormous detail. So this is the multivalent, extremely nuanced and accelerating production of Gaian self-perception that's happening in our time, mostly at a physiological level. If you talk of Gaian physiology. Of course, for us, we're also interested in the soul, the anima mundi, so the Gaia's soul, and maybe the world spirit. So I make a distinction between the anima mundi and the Weltgeist, right? The world soul and the world spirit. So there's the world body, which Earth system science studies. But we should also pay attention to the world spirit, which is the movements of history and civilization, and the world soul, which is the deeper archetypal patternings of world history and so on. So we need an integral Gaia theory, in other words, which would include and honor the enormous, wondrous sciences of Earth system sciences, but add to that the sciences of the soul and spirit. Okay? So here's the older view. You have the geosphere with its various spheres, and then the biosphere added onto it as a kind of thin layer. And the human is just one organism among the community of organisms that constitutes the biosphere. Now, in a sense, this is true, right? Who can deny this? Except for the fact that the human now has become a geological force. And the activities, our choices over the next few years will determine the fate of the whole biosphere. In other words, the human has constituted its own distinct sphere, the anthroposphere, which we see in many ways. This is a representation of various Facebook connections across the planet, but it could be any form of communication and transport planet-wide. That's just another interesting image I found of digital Earth. Not a literal picture, but a true representation of the number of satellites currently in orbit around the Earth. There are this many satellites.
How many?
Too many to count. I mean, I'm sure there are numbers, but it's changing because some of them get destroyed, some of them fall, and so on. I used to know the approximate number, but I don't know right now.
Does every country put them in there?
Not every country, but you know, the majority of them have been put up by American, Russian, and European countries. But you know, China has them, India has them. Yeah, many countries have them now. Many of them are no longer functional, so they're so-called space junk, which is very dangerous because when one of these collides with something, it breaks up into many pieces which are traveling at thousands of miles per hour. And when one of these pieces hit another one, that destroys it, creates more pieces. So there's real worry that this could initiate the, I keep on forgetting the name of the cycle. It's not Kessler's, maybe something like Kessler cycle, I'm not sure. A kind of domino effect, which could actually wipe out the vast majority of functional satellites fairly quickly if enough of them get destroyed. So there's enormous money being spent now on means to remove the space junk. And one of the things they're doing, of course, is pushing satellites into higher orbits that are not in danger of the space junk. Anyway, but the thing I want you to think of here too, this is not just the Earth with all sorts of extraneous garbage. It is that, but the satellites are Earth. I mean, they're literally made of Earth stuff, and they were made by us, and we were made by Earth, by Gaia. So these satellites are physical infrastructure that are allowing for the self-reflexivity and self-perception of Gaia. Okay? They're also allowing for, obviously, surveillance on the part of the police state, and they're being used by the forces of empire. So these two things are always happening at the same time. You have the kind of geopolitical power motive that I just summarized by empire, and that's what's really happening. And at the same time, what's happening is a new form of planetary consciousness is trying to be born. So here we have just some more graphs that point to what has happened since, well, here these go back to around 1750, but what you'll notice is that almost all of them start to go exponential right after 1945 about. So the beginning of the nuclear age is also the beginning of what many people call the Great Acceleration. So that's the acceleration toward this event horizon that of some kind of singularity or mutation that we're approaching. So Earth system trends on the right, socioeconomic trends on the left. I always like to add jokingly they should have one number of emails, you know, just over the last, because it just goes like that. I mean, I can remember when there were no emails, you know, no cell phones. It's hard to imagine. Anyway, it's changed so rapidly. And not only has everything changed so rapidly, but the rate of change is accelerating. Okay? Do you feel it? Who feels it? I'm just curious. Okay, good. I'm not alone. Okay, we don't have too many slides left, just so you know. Excuse me. While this acceleration is happening, and since the Great Acceleration, one of the exciting things that is happening is a transformation of our sense of time and of time in cosmic space. I mean, we're all aware of the acceleration, but along with the acceleration is a growing sense that many people have, at least those who are fortunate enough to be able to spend, have the time to think about it, who are not struggling just to get by. There's a growing sense of what some people call deep time. So we're all familiar with this, at least in our course here, especially through the work of Brian Swim and Thomas Berry and the new story of the universe story. In more traditional universities, there's a movement that people are calling big history instead of the new story. Now, this is from the Big History Project. It just shows, this slide shows you some of the major thresholds that big history likes to talk about. From the primal flaring forth, or the Big Bang, roughly 14 billion years ago, up to the present. So big history tends to identify 9 main thresholds. So the first one is the Big Bang itself. Then you have, almost immediately after, you have the formation of galaxies and stars. Right? Very, very soon after the primal flaring forth, galaxies and stars sort of condense out of that fireball. Right? Then you have our solar system forming, and probably all sorts of other solar systems, right? Roughly around 5 billion years ago. So this scale, you can see, is not proportional. It's a logarithmic sort of scale, right? So if this is 1,000 years, right, to get to 14 billion years ago, you'd probably have to go, I don't know, to Mars maybe? I don't know. It'd be very, 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 very far. So our hominins appear, 3 billion years ago. And then you have the historical period, roughly 5,000 years ago, with writing. And then you have global connection, it says. This is the beginning of the planetary era, 500 years ago. Here you have the Anthropocene, beginning around 60 years ago. Okay? And then you have now. Okay? So what's emerging is, on the one hand, a better understanding of the enormous depths of time that have preceded us, the major thresholds in the evolutionary process that have led to our present, and third, the fact that we now stand on an evolutionary threshold that is as big, as important as certainly the beginnings of the planetary era, as big as the beginnings of history 5,000 years ago, and since it involves potential mass extinction of species and a new geological age, it's actually as big as, it's as big as, certainly the multicellular organisms. I mean, it might even be as big as the appearance of life itself. It seems to constitute a genuine threshold in deep time. And I would suggest that the nature of that threshold is that it's when a planet becomes self-aware. Okay? It's the birth of a potential Gaian consciousness and everything that might mean. This is a major, unparalleled threshold, and we happen to be alive. Not only do we happen to be alive while it's happening, we are the vehicles for it happening. This is one of our great gifts. Now, while our sense of time is expanding to this incredible depths, and with a knowledge of the qualitative thresholds that we've crossed to get to where we are, we're also having this revolution in our sense of space, of cosmic space. Now, this is, when I ask people what they think it is, most people say neurons. It really does look like neurons. but it's actually a computer-generated image based on best available data of the large-scale structure of the physical cosmos. Yeah? And, you know, what does that mean? Well, if you were to take this little area here and blow it up, you'd see that it's constituted by billions of galaxies, among which is our galaxy of the Milky Way, right? So it says Milky Way, but you can't actually see the galaxy. Our galaxy would actually just be a little speck here in very dense clusters of galaxies. But this is our local neighborhood in the cosmos that is called Laniakea, and it too looks remarkably like neuronal connections with synapses and dendrites and so on. Now, the modeling of this neighborhood is quite fascinating. You can go online and see a modeling of it projected through cosmological time. And what you see is that it's actually moving. Things are flowing. The clusters of galaxies are flowing toward these great attractors. And so there's like a void. It's almost like a yin and a yang. You can't see it here, but there's a kind of pole toward which everything is flowing and another pole which is, it's remarkable. But so this is just a tiny little speck within this tissue of the cosmic body. Okay. Love this image. It's an artist's rendition, however, using actual images from the Hubble telescope, beginning with images of Earth right in the center. But again, the distances are not, they're logarithmic. They're not all proportional. See, because if we were standing on Earth, right, like the distance between Earth and Saturn, to be able to see them like that, you would need to, Saturn would actually be probably somewhere in Alaska. It's unbelievably vast, the distances, even just between the planets, let alone once you start to leave the solar system. And then we would come to our nearest stars. So the nearest star to us, Alpha, it's either Alpha Centauri or Alpha Prime, I think it's about 4 light years away, 4 to 7 light years. So traveling at light speed, it would take years to get to just our closest star. Enormously far away. Then as we go out, we would eventually leave our galaxy and encounter our closest galactic neighbor, Andromeda, and eventually other galaxies. Then you start to get into what's called the deep field of galaxies. Now, of course, the further we go in space, at least the deeper we peer into space, the further back in time we're looking, because it takes that much longer for the light to reach us. So as you go out from the center, you're not only going further out into greater distances and vaster reaches of space, but into deeper and deeper time, until you come to the furthest layer that we have any way of perceiving here, which is the cosmic microwave background radiation. So what's left over from the Big Bang, this electromagnetic radiation that is reaching us even now from every direction of the cosmos, right? Which is amazing to think of. And one of the things it tells us is that the Big Bang was not, way over there, because it's reaching us from every direction. And it wouldn't matter where you were in the cosmos, it's always reaching you from every direction. Which seems to suggest that that moment of origin, the primal flaring forth, that center is everywhere, right? Because it's reaching us from everywhere. This is one of the excuse me, the prime experimental evidence for the idea of an omnicentric universe. So our sense of space and time have gotten stretched to the limit where they can no longer be confined within or understood in terms of the Cartesian Newtonian world picture, which initiated the planetary era and which made possible the technological and industrial revolutions and so on. Right? There's a new sense of space and time, a new sense of the cosmos. And it's coinciding with a new planet and a new phase in the evolution of the planet itself. It's also coinciding with the first experimental evidence we have ever, and this is just over the last 20 years, of the existence of other planets. Now you may say, well, what do you mean? Didn't we always know that there were other planets? No, we didn't. I mean, people didn't even have any experimental evidence of the existence of other galaxies until fairly recently, let alone other planets. So, but starting about 20 years ago, the first experiments were able to deduce through disturbances in light spectra and so on, not direct observation through telescopes, but through other means, the existence of other planets. And the astounding thing now is the number of these other planets. It's basically, our galaxy alone has, I can never remember how many stars. Is it 300 billion? 300 billion stars? I'm not sure. A lot of stars. And it seems like pretty much 1 out of 3 at least of these stars has planets. And many of these are Earth-like. Okay? So just our galaxy alone, let alone the billions and billions of other galaxies, the cosmos is probably chock full of Earth-like planets. This is something that we're just now learning. It's so exciting to think of. The sad part is that we'll probably never be able to get even to the closest one. There may be one, but we think there's an Earth-like planet orbiting Alpha Prime, which is our closest star. But even with the most advanced leading-edge rocket technology that we can think of for the foreseeable future, it would take thousands of years to get there. That's the closest star. Okay? Nevertheless, many people are dreaming of Earth 2.0, finding a new Earth, an alternate Earth. And even if maybe it's just going to be terraforming Mars or moon bases and so on, but the real dream is to find another Earth. I think this is fascinating to think of, and I support the science, and I'm totally fascinated by it. At the same time, I think rather than an Earth 2.0, we need to be working toward a humanity 2.0 for a new version of the human presence, which will involve, it's already involving a new Earth, but unless we're able to mutate and evolve the human sort of operating system on Earth, this Earth will perish and certainly we will never reach any other exoplanet. Okay? Now there are indications of this revolution in the nature of the human, that have been underway for some time. An inspiring document coming out of the UN is the Earth Charter, that Mary Evelyn Tucker had an important role in drafting, that I encourage you to look at if you haven't seen it before. A non-binding agreement, but which should be the sort of meta basis for all constitutions, nation states and otherwise. And it's a prime example, the Earth Charter, of what Pope Francis and others are calling for in terms of an integral ecology. Okay? So you can see that here, so what would an integral ecology be? Well, Pope Francis says that it would be, at the very minimum, a recognition that the cry of the earth, that ecological distress, is inseparable from the cry of the poor, or from human distress. So the human and the other than human are part of a single, not only system scientifically, but of a single moral concern. So to do an integral ecology is to do social justice, just as to do integral social justice means to be taking care of our common home. Now the home here is the oikos, right, which is the root word for not only ecology but economy. So integral ecology would be minimally that. Here you see it in the Earth Charter. Can't read it, but if you just read the preamble, you'll see principles: respect and care for the community of life, ecological integrity, social and economic justice, democracy, nonviolence, and peace. Right? See, these are the main principles. And I really encourage you to read it, the Earth Charter. And our beautiful Pope Francis, calling for an integral ecology at the center of this very inspiring document. So what's happening with Francis, at least, and hopefully it'll continue to happen for the Catholic Church, is also happening in other religious communities. There is a greening of religion going on that you can learn about if you haven't already visited by going to the Yale website on the Forum on Religion and Ecology, FORE.org, I think it is. The Forum on Religion and Ecology. All kinds of resources and inspiring material showing religious communities across the planet who are retrieving elements of their own traditions, reforming them where necessary, and trying to find within their traditions and between the traditions a commonality that's based on concern for our common home, our oikos, which is Gaia. Okay? And this is, I think, a beautiful symbol of what some of us are calling the second axial age, right? The first axial age, which peaked around 300 years before Christ, 300 to 500 years before Christ, but where, at its red hot peak, you see the simultaneous emergence without any of them knowing each other of the Buddha, of Lao Tzu, of Confucius, of Mahavira, of Zoroaster, the early Greek philosophers, some of the great early Jewish prophets, all of them popping up at the same time and giving birth to these world religions and world religious traditions. That's the first axial age. And it's out of the first axial age that you will eventually get one strand of it, one genetic strain, or like one bacterial strain. You can imagine these are like multiple strains of a certain species that comes out of the first axial age. Well, it'll happen to be out of the Christian one that the modern period in modern science is going to evolve, right? So the planetary era and the mutation of civilization and the birth of the Anthropocene comes out of the first axial age. It takes a while for it to happen, but that's where it comes from. Now we're at the point of a potential second axial age. And the difference from the first is that the second axial age, although if there's still to be religious traditions, they have to grant that they can no longer claim to have exclusive access to the transcendent ultimate. I mean, you can believe that in your private life. And, you may be right, who knows? But at least they all have to agree on the shared origin and destiny as members of this living earth. Right? And it's happening. There are indications of this second axial age happening. There are also, continuations of one of the early impulses of the Gaian understanding. I just point out this book. It just so happens, so Phoebe, I didn't know you were going to be here, but I had this slide here of Stephen Harding's lovely book, Animate Earth, where he is taking Lovelock and Margulis's original Gaia theory further in a way that is trying to incorporate the idea of the world soul. So it's not just it honors and includes the scientific understanding of Earth that now is described more through Earth system sciences, but it tries to recover the pre-modern, animistic even, view of the Earth as a living body and of the human as participating in the living body of Earth, of Gaia. So it's a beautiful book. I encourage you to see it. And there are other movements. I mean, law, this book and this movement coming more out of Thomas Berry, who was the first one to propose the need to reformulate law on the basis of Gaian principles. So to develop an earth jurisprudence, a new meta law or philosophy of law based on our embeddedness in the life of Gaia. So there's this movement, Earth Justice. Wonderful posters. Any of you seen the posters in BART, Civic Center BART, for Earth Justice? They're, some of their lines are great. Their clients, what is it now? I can't.
Are spoiling the earth. One is spoiling the earth and the others are saving the earth.
Yeah, and they have these really catchy, wonderful phrases of, basically you've got empire, which is trashing the earth, and then you have, earth justice. So you look out for their posters. So it's a new and exciting field. And finally, there's, I already mentioned integral ecology, which is, the idea has gotten quite a boost from the Pope's encyclical, but it's a wider movement, and hopefully it's going to become even more popular. This is the book that I co-edited with PCC alum Sam Mickey, Professor Sam Mickey now, and Adam Robert, who is still finishing his dissertation. Right, so here we are, Alex Gray image, the cosmic tree of life, Gaia as the living, beating heart in the cosmic tree of life, poised between these two possibilities that Joanna Macy would call the great unraveling on the right, dominated by capital and industrial civilization, or the great turning on the left. And they're both happening at once. We don't know which one will succeed. And then the last slide I'll leave you with, to return to this first one, which is the singularity. This is a single stroke from a very big brush, actually, like this, by a friend of mine, Kazuaki Tanahashi. He's a Zen teacher, a scholar, master calligrapher. He was also a student and family friend of Ueshiba Sensei, the founder of Aikido, among other things. But he lives in Berkeley. He's an amazing being. And this is an enso. So it's one of a favorite practice of Zen people, drawing of a circle in one motion that embodies a moment. But it's a moment. So he has a series of many, many, many ensos, and they're all called Miracle of this moment. Right? Sometimes the ensos will be closed circles, but often they're left open. And I prefer the open one because it suggests uncertainty, possibility, and it captures something of the nature of our moment. So that's it. Okay. All right. I don't know how we did for time. Not too bad. Okay. So we can either, if there are any just initial questions, I know it's a lot of material, or if you want to just make mental note and then we come back after break. What would you like to do? Come back after break? Okay. So keep your thoughts alive and we'll...
I just have like a logistical question. Is there any chance we can get these slides?
Yeah, I had them on a Google Drive. I'll send you the link.